And in fact, I don't quite understand the reason I was invited to give lectures on Kalmyk in this school. Although I like the environment and I like the opportunity to listen to others. But frankly, I'm just going to speak about one language which doesn't, without much aerial perspective. And the only reason I think of is that it's definitely the language of Russia, and probably it's slightly less well represented in typologically oriented discussions of languages of Russia. So maybe that's the reason why. But okay, probably you have some idea what's the reason of coming here. So I don't have to explain on this. So we're going to have 4 classes, as I said, and that's the outline of our course. So today we're going to have some kind of an introduction with genealogical and slightly genealogical profile on Kalmyk, of Kalmyk, and maybe some discussions of its typological features, as well as phonology, which I try to make as short as possible. And then we're going to have some grammatical topics in the classes to follow, so Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Okay. So, Kalmyk, or for reasons which will become clear in a few moments, it is sometimes referred to as Kalmyk Oirats, is a Mongolic language, which is spoken by theoretically quite a number of people, so 80,000 people according to the official census. But, and it's spoken in Kalmykia, so near the Caspian Sea in the steppes, or what they call steppes, which is basically rather desert. Anyway, despite the high figures from the official census, the actual number of speakers is very low, so I would not fully agree with the official UNESCO site, which calls Kalmyk a definitely endangered language. It's exactly what the status of the language is, because it's not so much used in everyday situations, but those who dwell in Kalmykia. So there are many contributing factors which influence the very poor sociolinguistic status of Kalmyk nowadays. And maybe the major factor, at least that's what the speakers of Kalmyk say, and I think they are right, and it's also supported by what sociolinguists wrote on Kalmyk. If the deportation, so as you probably heard there were several populations, several peoples who were deported to Siberia in the 40s, late 30s and 40s. So for Kalmyk it was 1943, and it was during the war, so they were officially declared a traitor nation, which was of course humiliating and everything. They were moved so that no Kalmyks were left behind. So it's unimaginable. They were in just about 1 week. They moved to Siberia and Kazakhstan. They were moved, transported to Siberia and Kazakhstan, and they spent there like 13 years. The language was officially banned, so they were not allowed to speak that language anywhere except for their homes. And they were mixed with Russian populations, and importantly, they also were mixed together. So sometimes there were several Kalmyk families living in one place, but these were not the families which used to stay together in close proximity in Kalmykia. So the social networks were completely lost. And it's in fact an act of national heroism or something like that, that after they were eventually allowed to come back, it's amazing how well they actually have rebuilt some of those lost languages. So, for example, we still are able to speak about 2 major dialects. I will mention it in a few moments, which under circumstances a miracle. Yeah, so because it's unimaginable how could they actually keep all of those despite these years. But as I said, for in terms of in generational terms, it's very visible that speakers who were born after that, you understand that these are now elderly people, are not in terms of their first language is mostly Russian, and of course it's very bad for future generations as well. So probably there are some chances that the situation can be better, but it's not quite certain. So it's now mainly preserved in a few villages in Genealogical, so just one of those districts in Kalmykia, and that's exactly where our data come from. So okay, so some more information about the history of Kalmyk. So literacy, now they have literary language based on Cyrillic alphabet. Historically, they have a very well preserved written record of which is important for linguists as well. So first in the Middle Ages, they had Urdu-based script, which was used by ancestors of modern Kalmyk when they were part of Oirats population, which I will mention as well. And then they had their own Kalmyk script, which is called phonology, literally clear script. I'm not quite sure it's exactly clear for us now, but it looks like this. And they've got lots of manuscripts from 17th century when it was introduced by a local enlightenment who was called Zaya Bandita, so it sounds very sweet for Russians. They mention Zaya as all the time, Nash Zaya, something like that. So yeah, but then it was abandoned in the 20s, and it's also very important, I think, and it contributed to the loss of their original written culture. So it was really, they were really, it's amazing how long they kept their feeling of being part of the large Buddhist tradition related to Tibet and China and things like that, and it all disappeared in the 20th century. So not very long time ago, but I think it had some consequences for the way they view the world and for their attitudes toward their own language as well. So, as I said, the ancestors of modern Kalmyks were Oirats. So one of the Mongolic tribes who traveled, migrated from Dzungaria to this current region. Well, it was a little bit more complicated, so they had a couple of stopovers. We can skip those. In the 17th century, 16th, 17th century. So Dzungaria is actually part of Xinjiang, whatever it is pronounced in English. So the Russian Xinjiang, whoever can pronounce that in English, I don't know. So the westernmost northern part of China, eastern Turkestan, you can also refer to this area. Okay, and nobody actually knows why on earth did they have this idea. So they know very well that they belong to Dzungaria. They have these connections, and we will see some maps in a few moments, and you will see that the distance is really huge. So they are really very far from their closest relatives, let's say, and they are linguistically very close to those Oirats who are left behind, so who are still there. So it's basically the westernmost dialect of Oirat, which is just 3,000 kilometers away from okay, so dialectal differentiation is relatively weak. Two main dialects are Torbut and Torbet. So Torbut is the main dialect on which the literary language is based, and we work with speakers of Torbet theoretically. So maybe some data we will see will be mixed in this respect. I'm sorry, but I hope it's not very important. So, finally, what I wanted to say is that context-induced influences are not very numerous. So that's why I don't understand these courses here in this program, because I talked to Aidan Grossman yesterday, and he said that, well, it appears that Kalmyk is the Icelandic of Northern Asia, and I think it's exactly the case. So it's really the least influenced language in this area, I'd say. So I'll mention a few moments where, a few aspects in which probably there is some areal affinity to some Dagestani languages, but maybe it's just a coincidence, so I'm not sure. So of course it was, in terms of its literary tradition, it was largely influenced by Tibetan language, and well, of course, but whether it goes deep into the structure of language, I'm not sure. Literally Mongolian or Half-Mongolian is Mongolic is very important as well, but they're so very close that it's not about its typological profile, definitely, because typologically they're the same. It's more about the relationships between Russian and Old George Slavonic or something like that. Yeah. And finally, okay, of course, Russian influences everything within the territory of Russia. And Kalmyk is not an exception. Okay, so let's have a look at the map. So here is Kalmykia, and as I said, it's not the friendliest environment you can imagine. So there are some areas here which are white, which means that they are not inhabited. And in fact, this area, which is the area where Kalmyks live, is not densely populated at all. So it's sparsely populated. So you see, they're theoretically this is a steppe region, but I think they just use this word. They like it more than pustina. So they prefer to think it's steppe. Okay. As for the neighbors, you see they're north of the Caucasus, and nowadays they sometimes have conflicts with Darwa people, something like that, who are traveling here and there, and Kalmyks sometimes. But generally speaking, not so much. Yeah, and it's not very deep, and I don't think any real bilingualism was ever involved. So compared to a very complex situation directly to the south of Kalmyk region, here we don't see almost nothing. No relatives in close proximity, so the nearest Mongols are in Mongolia and China, yeah? Or maybe Afghanistan, but they don't even know this. So, so it's not very important. So, in what I'm going to say in these lectures is based on two main sources. So the available grammars of Kalmyk, which are, well, I'd say good quality Soviet-style grammars from the 60s mainly, and our own field-based data, which are also published in 2009. So I'm sorry it's not fresh stuff, but okay. As I said, I don't think many typologists are working on Kalmyk nowadays. So. And of course, I'm very much indebted to other people who participated in this joint endeavor of studying Kalmyk. So I'm speaking alone, but some data or some insights come from other people. Okay, and I also use descriptive conventions from our group, which might be, well, which is different from conventions you can find elsewhere. But again, I hope you don't mind. Oh, as long as it was text, you could see quite well, and now it's words. So that's the way typical Kalmykian landscape looks like. You don't see much here, but in fact, even if it were completely dark, you wouldn't see much either. So nothing. There's nothing. Just a very flat landscape with some cattle, sometimes okay. No clouds ever. Well, people say lots of snow in the winter. I haven't been there in the winter, and it's very hot in summer. You can't grow almost nothing except for watermelons. So okay. So you don't have agriculture. They don't have nothing to do. They're Buddhists, and if you are considering converting into Buddhism, you can go to Kalmykia, and it's a very good environment because you can just sit and relax and meditate, and after a while you will probably be, well, okay, I think this one is better. Yeah, so just a little bit of yellow, a little bit of blue, and that's it. Yeah, so, well, yellow and gray depends on month. Yeah, so it starts with yellowish and then it's perfectly gray by August. Yeah. Okay, I think pictures like this are more or less the same all across the globe. That's how their bellies look like. And they're happy. They're happy, they like their environment very much. Okay, they're Buddhist, as I said. That's their capital. And they are quite traditional in many respects. So their cattle breeding hasn't changed too much during the Soviet era. So, of course, to some extent they had this opposite, but after they were ruined, everybody was happy. They can go back to their traditional cattle breeding. Okay, so I can help tell you a story which I always tell about Kalmyks and their view on nature. I remember talking to a person, to a local person who actually once traveled to Finland from St. Petersburg in Kalmykia, whatever is the English word, yeah, which is believed to be a very beautiful place, like with lots of pine trees and lakes and rocks, very beautiful, full of, the landscape which is photographed a lot and so forth. And asked if he liked this trip from St. Petersburg to Caspian, he said no, because there are so many rocks and trees that природа не видно. So the nature is not visible. So his idea was that all these things just distract you from seeing the nature, which is nothing. Yeah, so, and I think it's very typical of their view of how the world must be. So they do the same in their home. So the most beautiful home you can have is a perfectly empty room with just a sofa or something like that. Yeah, so you can sit and relax and do nothing. If you have some stuff like kitchen utensil, it's better if you just hide it so you don't pay attention to it. So I like this attitude very much. Okay, we have to somehow get back to linguistics okay, some genealogical data. So it's part of the Mongolic family, which is very small, so some 10, maybe 12 languages are centered around standard Halkha Mongolian, the official language of Mongolia. And of course, there is some debate as to whether some idioms are dialects of languages. We don't have to care about that too much. And this family is rather shallow. Its estimates in terms of time depth vary between 800 years and 2,000 years. And you will understand why the range is so huge on the next slide, I think. So probably the situation was like that. Probably there was some dispersal of Mongolic languages and some variation of Mongolic varieties, which started about 2,000 years ago. But then there was Genghis Khan. So the Mongolic Empire, which served as a melting pot for everyone. Yeah, so it was, in terms of history of this language family, it was kind of a bottleneck. So probably, and there are some oblique indication that there was some variation before that period, but then it was mixed. So there were probably some Mongolic varieties which were perfectly understandable, and they covered really huge territory. Yeah, so the territory was probably the biggest empire that existed ever in the world. Yeah, and that's why the story of this family started anew, so to say. So that's why some people say that, well, it's only 800 years old. So that's why when new branching that side, let's say, started anew. Yeah? So maybe that's probably one of the reasons why people who try to build a well-behaved phylogenetic tree for Mongolic languages found it very difficult. But I wonder if there is any family where people say that we've got really neat phylogenetic trees. I don't know. Mongolic doesn't, definitely. Probably the main distinctions within Mongolic family are between central Mongolic languages, which cover huge territory in Mongolia and the Buddhist Republic within Russia, and peripheral smaller languages which are hidden in tiny pockets in Afghanistan and China and so forth. So, and some of these small languages preserve some archaic features which are lost in the main core Mongolic languages. And, curiously enough, I remind you once again that although Kalmyk is very far in terms of geography, linguistically speaking, it's a well-behaved core Mongolic language. So despite this huge distance, so linguistically speaking, it's just a variety of Oirats. So okay, let's take a look at the map. So these are the core Mongolic languages. So Mongol proper, Halka-Mongol and Mongolian. This is Buddhist, which is very close to it. And here are Oirats. So several areas where they're, and here where Kalmyks are. So a huge distance, but linguistically it's almost the same. Much more similar than, let's say, Mongol in Afghanistan and Shirai Uyghur, for example, or Yellow Uyghur in China and so forth. And that word is almost a mixed language. So pretty much of what I'm going to say about Kalmyk will be also true about Halka-Mongol and Buddhist. So they're similar in many respects. Okay, yeah, that's the map of which shows the extent of the Mongolic Empire here, and that's the core languages, and here is Mongolic. The same. So the historical, let's say, provide some historical perspective. And yeah, that's the funny thing. That's how Kalmyk is found in the walls. Yeah. So the walls just disregard what has happened in the recent 300 years. Yeah. So they just think that Kalmyks are still there. I don't know if it was a deliberate choice. I never had a chance to ask anybody. Well, it makes some sense because it's definitely not a language of the Caucasus or something. So if you have some distances based on data from walls, probably it makes more sense to think that Kalmyks are actually there. But physically they are not for about 300 years, yeah, even more than that. Yeah, okay. All right, let's. I just have to say a few words about the topic which I hate, namely discussion of the so-called Altaic languages and whether or not Turkic and Mongolic and linguistic and probably Korean and Japonic languages make a family. Well, I think you all know something about that. There are people who are absolutely sure that they are, and there are some people who doubt. I'm not sure if there are any people left who are certain that they are unrelated, but okay, it's not very important for us. What is important is that, of course, you expect, and not without some reason, to find some Altaic type features in a language like Kalmyk, and well, there won't be much surprise here. You will, in fact, indeed encounter some features of that kind in Kalmyk. So, what are those features? So, for example, vowel harmony, which is found throughout Altaic languages, and not so much elsewhere. So maybe it's considered it's a family-specific trait. At least that kind of vowel harmony, and we're gonna discuss it in more detail today because we are going to speak about phonology. So, of course, the first thing you see in most encyclopedic entries on Kalmyk and similar languages that it's an agglutinative language. Well, kind of yes. But of course we will see lots of deviations from the canonical agglutinative type in Kalmyk, and the problem is that I don't think Kalmyk is really so much exceptional in this respect. I think that the frequency with which you encounter deviations of this kind are similar in other Mongolic and in other Turkic and linguistic languages as well. So let's have a brief checklist of these features. So lack of accumulation, lack of situations in which a morpheme covers true categories at the time. Well, almost true for Kalmyk. So sometimes segmentation is really problematic. So you better view some morphemes as simultaneously representative of two categories. But it's relatively shallow, and well, yes, there is no accumulation, more or less. Lack of stem alternations. False, or not quite true. Yeah, so in fact, again, people who want to see some agglutinative basis behind the modern actual system of Kalmyk will explain away all those disturbances. Say like, you know, this is automatic and this is just a borrowing and this is a, I don't know, a regular pattern which emerged not very long time ago and so forth. But in fact, if you collect all of those instances together, the amount of stem alternation is really huge. I'd say, well, it doesn't sound much less than it is in Russian. So lots of it. So, and finally, the lack of affix suppletion in husbandman's terms or in fractional classes or something like that. Again, something you'd expect from a well-behaved agglutinative language. This is largely true for verbs, but not so much so for nouns. We will see that there are some weird phenomena in terms of inflectional classes. So. Again, historically this is quite explicable, and yes, maybe it's not that deep as in many Dagestani languages, for example, but generally speaking, it's, I'd say, it's a very coarse representation of actual facts when you just state that Kalmyk is an agglutinative language. Okay. So what are the other Altaic type features? Lots of suffixation, no prefixation, true. So no prefixes at all. There are lots of Altaic type serialization. Okay, serialization is just one of the terms which is applied to phenomenon in which some grammatical verbal meanings like aspect and accents are, and model meanings and things like that, and negation in some contexts is expressed by combination of by analytical combinations which involve grammaticalized verbs. This is true and it's very widespread in Kalmyk, no less than in other Altaic languages. SOV and left branching, which is relatively rigid, but again, if you go to actual texts, you see lots of deviations. And linguists, especially those who work within traditional Altaic tradition, always say that, well, it's because of the Russian influence, or it's something irrelevant because of some errors of speech planning or something like that. But in fact, it's quite frequent and quite robust and to some extent predictable. So I'd say that at least on the clause level, SOV, as is also typical of many other Altaic languages, is just the default pattern, but it's not the obligatory pattern. Okay. So yeah, and dependent clauses are typically headed by one of the numerous non-finite forms. So finite subordination is rare. This is true, and in fact, well, as elsewhere in Russia, they have some patterns that are modeled based on Russian influence, but they are not very frequent. So in fact, even the younger speakers master non-finite subordination very well. So long participial relative clauses and things like that are quite widespread. Okay. Just one slide on whether or not Altaic languages are indeed related to each other genealogically. Well, you know, on the one hand, there are many words that are similar and regularly so. On the other hand, it's not quite clear whether it's a result of ancient context, which definitely took place before these branches started their dispersal across the northern Eurasia. So certainly they are all, so for all practical purposes, I think it's not relevant, because we can discuss these languages as very similar to each other in many structural respects, and whether or not these tribes were genealogically related when they were located more or less near to each other in Eastern Asia several thousand years ago, let's say, or it's not very relevant for our discussions at least. Okay, so that's the map. Again, we see that Mongolic languages like that, and they're flanked by linguistic languages which originated from here more or less, and about Turkic languages you also know that they covered huge distances from here to here, but probably they're from a region which was to the west of the alignment of Mongolic languages. So they were more or less together here, here, and here, and here, here, and here, and definitely shared lots of features at that period when they were all spoken in these areas. Okay. All right, phonology. We'll start with. I think we're going to have something like 5 minutes for phonology and word structure today. So what are the basic features? The basic features are here. So that's the vowel system. It's quite extensive, so it looks like very rich, lots of phonemes. But in fact, if you take a closer look, you find that it's very regular in many respects, and the system looks it looks bigger than it's historically reconstructed. So first, we see that there are long vowels, and they are completely parallel to short vowels, and for a reason which will become clear in a minute. Absolutely the same. Yeah, so full parallelism here, except for schwa, which is neither long nor short. It's, some say, extra short or something like that. And again, we're going to talk about that vowel in a minute. It's slightly problematic. So then we also see some parallelism between front vowels and back vowels, although here the parallelism is not full. So there are some pairs like u and u, o and e, a and a, but e and e are front vowels which do not have any back counterpart, which is a little problematic for a vowel harmony, and we'll see some tricky ways in which Kalmyks handle this problem. So somehow they circumvent it. Okay, there are, although theoretically the number of vowels is huge, there are lots of rules which ban the use of vowels in some specific context. For example, long vowels are only possible in first syllables. They are never tested anywhere else. And schwa is only possible in non-first syllable. In particular, you can't have a one-syllable word with just schwa. So the reason for that is very shallow, and it's very well reconstructed historically. It's the rule of shortening of all vowels in non-first syllables. It was massive and regular. So the rule was like all long vowels in non-first syllables were shortened to short and coincided with short vowels from the first syllable, whereas all short vowels in non-first syllables became schwa. So these rules explain both why there are no long vowels in non-first syllables and why schwa is not found in the first syllable. So theoretically, it poses a theoretical challenge because in fact, phonological system for first syllables and for non-first syllables are completely different. So it's very rich for first syllable. Besides, there are three more vowels, or, and which are not possible outside of the first syllable. So only in the first syllable you can see all of these. You can see all of these in the first syllable, but not schwa. Whereas in non-first syllables, you cannot have all of those, and you can also have middle vowels. So what you're left with is just 6 vowels: I, U, U, I, and schwa. That's it. Yeah.
I wonder how typologically relevant this kind of pattern is, because in northern Hanti you have something similar when in non-first syllables the middle row is absent.
Absolutely. So I didn't know about the Hanti system, but what is I think theoretically relevant is that you can find many minimal pairs which will prove that actually the short vowels in the first syllable are actually the same vowels which you find in non-first syllable, because some of them are always first in the first syllable, some are not, and then it's hard to prove that they are actually representatives of some the same unit, let's say, in the phonological structure and in fact, for some reason, they know this rule of shortening. So the native speakers somehow understand, because of compound words and things like that, they understand that vowels which are pronounced short in non-first syllables are related to long vowels in the first syllable. So despite orthography and so forth, they somehow make this association. So I think it's an important problem, let's say. So, okay, let's go further. So, schwa is especially problematic. So, again, first, we can start with a simple fact which shows that it's just regular vowel phoneme. And namely, there are minimal pairs. You can have something like ru and rg, which are associated with different meanings, and these words have the same structure except for schwa. So the r, schwa is here between the consonants, and rg, schwa is the final vowel in the word. Good, but there are many problems. First, schwa is often optional, and probably it is always optional. So it's hard to find any context where schwa is obligatory pronounced in all phonetic environments. So, for example, many words have word final schwa, like guru, and if you ask what's the Kalmyk for house, they will say guru, like that. That when this word is used in speech, most of the time it's realized as gir. So maybe there are some non-phonological rules that govern this usage. Yeah, so the choice of realization, whether schwa is realized or not. So again, as I said here, we have this minimal pair. If you choose, or the phonological environment is such that you have to pronounce this schwa, because alternatively you can pronounce both of these words as just r without nothing, and then they are undistinguishable. For example, and some contexts are very easy to find where schwa is obligatory, not pronounced. For example, I will say a few words more about this. You can't have schwa and any other vowel next to each other. So, for example, the same word gere, which is house, if you say something like ger avche, or to get, okay, it's just to marry will be literally to take a house or something like that, and it is ger avche. So you can say giri after. So you can have those two together. So in a nutshell, the rule is like that. If we have a phonological structure of words, we know some positions where schwa is potentially there. And we also know some positions where schwa cannot be pronounced. But whether or not those places where schwa is potentially there is actually realized, it seems to be a matter of speaker's choice to a large extent. Okay, so phonological representation is probably much more rich than actual realization. For example, yeah, it's not. I hope you don't take it too serious. So I know that orthography is relevant, but maybe to some extent it somehow influences their own view of their phonology. So they don't write the schwas at all. So you have a word which looks like this, which, well, looks as if it's perfectly unpronounceable, and in fact, it can be in its full realization. It's pronounced like kıdırmışnı, workers, kıdırmışnı, and it means that you can use schwas in 3 different positions here optionally, and the final one is not optional because it's stressed in this case, in this particular case. So, but if you need all of those, or you can skip some of those as well, depends on particular realization. So they're all optional, and they are very much sure that it looks like that. In fact, it takes lots of effort to prove that schwa can be found between L and M, for example. So here, not possible, but between other consonants, it is possible. Okay. So phonologically, probably the structure of this word is like here with all those schwas, but most of them are optional. So I don't know. Again, it's a problem of phonology. Let's say whether we try to make some rules which would predict what are the positions where it's at least optionally possible, and well, actually we failed. I never tried anything like that, but some people who tried failed. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask whether is it possible that this is not a question of segmental content of the word forms, but rather of syllabification? Because if you start from the syllable structure, then maybe you would not need all of these schwas to the same extent, or they may fall into 2 different types.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So I also think that, well, syllabic structure is very important, and I mentioned, well, the first thing is that with stress, I can understand. Of course, I skipped some rules which can be based on this. For example, if you have the last potentially present schwa, the last syllable contains a potentially present schwa, and the previous vowel in the same word is also a schwa, then this last one should be pronounced and stressed. But if the previous vowel is not a schwa, so it's something real, then you can just skip this other schwa and make the previous syllable stressed. Okay. So with this, the simplest example was with this giri. Yeah. So if it's giri, then the stress stays on schwa. But if you choose not to pronounce schwa, then it's giri. Of course, it's okay. It's not a problem. But with longer words, with lots of schwas there, it doesn't work because, well, generally speaking, there's no gain in just losing one of these schwas because you have to stress another schwa instead. Yeah. So it doesn't make any sense. So I think that stress is very important. Syllabification, yes, of course. But if there are rules that synchronically, without looking into history, can predict this, I doubt that there are minimal pairs, as I said, which would say that, well, which is, yes, it's not just automatic. Yeah, so it's not just automatic. So it's not like non-phonological schwas which are found in many languages. So it's very similar, it's very close to it, but it seems to be a phoneme after all, although very weird. Did I answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay, the consonants, quite rich. So, well, nothing particularly unusual, I'd say, except for probably a contrast between palatalized and non-palatalized dentals. Maybe these are not dentals, I'm not sure about this, but definitely there are pairs of palatalized and non-palatalized, which was very nice in the long run because now they don't have the usual problem of accommodating Russian loanwords with palatalized and non-palatalized dentals. Do you want to ask something, Peter?
Well, probably if I may.
Yeah, sure.
Very silly question.
Very silly.
Very silly question. Do you exactly mean that they are palatalized and not belong to the palatal series?
No, they don't belong to the palatal series. No. They are palatalized. No, they are palatalized. They are not palatal.
Because there are other languages, well, not necessarily in this area, where there are pairs of consonants which to the Russian ear appear as
So that's to put it mildly, phonology is not my forte. So that's what people say. People say that they are palatalized. Maybe they're ultimately wrong, but that's what's written by those who think they know.
Because if you just make them palatable, then it sort of looks more, admittedly looks more typologically.
Absolutely, yeah, it does. But well, theoretically, there are even situations where historically we can reconstruct environments where these were probably related to each other, and they are seem to be not too different in terms of place of articulation. So maybe not. There are some. An important question is again the loanword phonology. Of course, the number of loanwords is huge, and Tibetan loanwords didn't cause any problem, or these problems were solved long ago. So there are no special consonants in Tibetan loanwords, but Russian is a problem because, of course, as elsewhere, they use lots of Russian words, and they often contain consonants which were not typical of Kalmyk, and these are here in the brackets. So it's again a big problem both in terms of theoretical analysis and in terms of actual use, because there are some rules which affect non-loanword consonants, and it's not quite clear whether Russian loanwords should obey those rules as well. Okay, so I'll skip the details, but we have to remember that you see there are several instances like that. Although it is in fact a different story because again it's a parallel between L and things like that, which is inherited from Proto-Mongolic. But then for some reason it was almost lost and probably was just kept in a handful of words, like 5 of them, something. And some speakers, younger speakers actually use just regular R instead of R in these words. So there was a slow drift from R to R, so that the context was almost lost. But then they started to loan words, to borrow words from Russian. And there are some, another there, which is historically, of course, completely unrelated to what they inherited from Proto-Mongolic. And it looks like they have identified two things together. So they really think that Octave contains something which sounds very ancient Mongolic, let's say, which is not the case. But it's not quite clear if we really have to consider it as a separate phoneme. Okay, a few words about word structure and things like that. So the basic word structure, as I said, is just root and suffixes, no prefixes at all. The stress, as I mentioned before, is on the last syllable of the word, although it's movable if it happens, this last vowel happens to be the schwa. So it's sometimes possible. So it's the stress is fully predictable, hence non-phonological. You don't have minimal pairs, and as I said, if the final schwa is not pronounced, this stress automatically moves to just the previous syllable. So there are several complications. In fact, there are many complications, as I said before, which influence the shape of words so that it's not always so nicely agglutinative. And there are some rules that conspire together so that hiatus is not possible. So hiatus, any sequence of vowels one after another. So what are these rules? It's nice to see that the rules are not related to each other, but except for the teleological aspect. So teleologically they're similar. They give the same synchronic result, which is a very robust rule. They really can't pronounce vowels together. They avoid hiatus even in Russian loanwords. Okay, what are these rules, for example? First, as I mentioned, schwa is just a little. It's very easy because you can always get rid of a schwa if you don't like it. So, for example, let's say underlying form of the root, which means to hit, is tsoke, and sometimes it sounds like that, like tsoke, future form, something like that. But if you use suffix which has initial vowel, then schwa cannot be pronounced. You can't have anything like tsokurat or something like that, it's tsokat. So, alternatively, if a suffix begins in a vowel, all suffixes which begin in a vowel sometimes are attached to something, to a stem, which ends in a vowel as well. And for that purpose, you have the empathetic r, which is included. So, for example, if you have ad, which you know from here, from Zokat, you can also have it here, to dad, for example. But if you attach this to bu, which is to put down, to descend, or something like that, it's labile verb, then it's buha. Okay? So again, you see that there is a difference between schwa and other vowels in this respect. So what happens with other vowels is epenthetic r, so you have buha. Theoretically, you could have had this rule also applied in case of schwa, but it never happens. So you can have tsokurat. Okay? So theoretically, it's possible to solve the problem somehow, but no. So schwa is, let's say, the first rule to apply is to get rid of the schwas if they are unnecessary. So you get rid of this, and then this root, which is theoretically either tsoke or tsok, so either consonant final or vowel final, for purposes of word structure, it behaves as if it were a consonant final, and then you use ad, not rad. Okay? So the choice of ad or rad is fully automatic, but a special rule must be applied. So if you want, you can think about things like that in terms of rule ordering. Yeah? So the rule for schwa is to be applied before other rules. You can also describe it in other terms if you don't like rule ordering. But anyway, this is unpredictable. But importantly, there are many more rules like that. For example, there are lots of affixes, most notably the plural suffixes, but also other suffixes as well, genitive, for example, which have allomorphs, so that the choice of the allomorph is complicated and not fully predictable, but you can never have an allomorph which starts with the vowel if it is attached to a stem which ends in a vowel as well. other way around. Okay, so for example, if you have one of the plural suffixes, we will discuss them on Wednesday, is ud, and well, nobody knows actually which plural suffixes is attached to what. So their rules are lexical, but for some reason, ud is never chosen when the noun stem ends in a vowel, and the other way around. You cannot have chu, for example, if it's ends in a consonant. So what this means is that these rules are definitely not automatic. So it's not like a phonological rule of automatic insertion in order to avoid hiatus. But on the other hand, they have this common outcome, so that it's not possible to have two vowels one after another. Okay. So vowel harmony. So the basics about this rule. So in a nutshell, vowels and non-first syllables must have the same backness feature, so front or back, as the vowel in the preceding syllable. So normally, long word forms are either with front vowels throughout or with back vowels throughout. That's the default pattern. And it is also true for stems. So stems can be polysyllabic, more than one syllable, sometimes three. Typically, they are harmonic within them. And of course, it's also true for suffixes, for the many suffixes. So as in other well-behaved languages with vowel harmony, affixes come in pairs. So if an affix contains a vowel, and all affixes do contain a vowel, although sometimes it's schwa. Okay, I will say a few words about schwa. Anyway, so if an affix contains a real vowel, non-schwa, then it has at least two variants, for front vowel words and for back vowel words. Okay, like here we have some examples. Bu is the back vowel word, and it's bu-hat. Ke is the front vowel word, it's ke-hat. So is predicted based on this, and here are some examples with the plural. One of the many markers of plural. The choice is completely automatic, so it's either mood or mood, depending on the frontness. Okay. Of course, there are many complications. One kind of complications I won't talk about comes from Russian loanwords, because the first problem is that they are not necessarily harmonic. The second problem is, okay, if they're non-harmonic, let's say muzhik, something like that, which is either or, then the problem is how to treat it. As if it were a front vowel word or a back vowel word. The default is to treat words like that as back vowel, regardless of what are the vowels inside those mixed words. Okay, so that's the default. Although there is some variation, and sometimes these loan words are created on the fly. So they are not there in the lexicon, but they can use whatever, like, I don't know, boomer, for example. I remember it was mentioned in some text. And of course, it still has case affixes, and they have to be like either as if it's with u or something like that. And there is some variation, but there were more problems to that. So how to handle those vowels which do not have pairs? You probably remember the system of vowels here, and e is always front and e is always in front. So what about vowel harmony with words like that? So with e, the situation is very simple. They are well-behaved front vowels when they're in the first syllable or in the stem, but they are not never used in non-initial syllables. So that's the solution. you don't have this problem at all. It can trigger, it can, like kiruv, or we had kirat on the previous slide, are front vowel words because e is in the first syllable, and you just don't have this problem as far as this vowel is concerned as a potential target of the vowel harmony rule. Okay. Okay. So more or less the same is about o, and other vowels like that, which are not regularly used as vowel targets. And the only exception here is o, which is found in just one suffix, which, as you can guess, is grammaticalized not very long time ago, so it's used in negated context. It's basically a word which means something like there is no, something like that, and it does not obey the vowel harmony at all. So although o and theoretically exist, but they do not obey the rule of vowel harmony regularly, because neither o nor can be used in suffixes. So that's probably the explanation that why when this o was grammaticalized as a suffix, it actually didn't obey the common rule. Although exists, and you can easily imagine here, but still it's keshgo, not keshgo or something like that. So no fronting happens in contexts like this. Okay, so what about schwa? You also remember that it's doesn't have a phonological pair. Here, the situation is slightly different. So schwa actually behaves as if it were transparent for purposes of vowel harmony. Let's have some examples. Bakshi is a teacher, and it's a back vowel word. Bakshner is the plural form, but in fact, the schwa here phonetically has the back value, so it's bakshner. And when further affixes are attached on top of this syllable with schwa, it behaves as if it were a back vowel word as well. Yeah, so it's bakshner. Okay. So let's compare it with what happens here. Here we have the word for guest, gich, by the way. In isolation we will gich, So although here is the schwa and it doesn't change phonologically to anything else, because there is no counterpart for it, it behaves as if it were a front vowel which then transmits its front value to the following syllable. So a possible solution, and in fact, as I said, in terms of phonetic realization, these schwas are very different. So these here is bakshnerese and here gejnerese. So it's back and front. I'm not very good at pronunciation, but it's very well heard when native speakers pronounce these differences. So it's regular, phonetically speaking, it's regular pair of a front vowel as opposed to a back vowel. So why are they not different phonemes? Because there are never in minimal pairs, because it is only possible in non-first syllables. Schwa is never used in the first syllable. So whenever you find them somewhere else, it's fully predictable. So its phonetic realization as either front or back depends on something else in this word. You don't have to posit a separate phoneme. So theoretically, as I said, the origin of these schwas are just short vowels. I don't remember this, if I'm not mistaken, this particular one goes back to short R. But then this one goes back to short F. And they all of the short vowels in non-first syllables merge into schwa. So there is no phonological contrast, but there is some phonetic contrast. Again, a problematic case, and again, a nice way to solve the problem of vowel harmony when theoretically the table of vowels that you've got at your disposal looks as if it somehow contradicts this possibility, because it doesn't have this paired value, front versus back, but nevertheless they have a way around this question. Okay, so the vowel which is worst of all in this respect is E, and its longer counterpart E. So as we saw in some previous examples, it behaves as a front vowel if it's a trigger of vowel harmony. Well, first of all, when it's used in roots like this, or we saw DHA on the previous slide and something like that. So if E is there, it's invariably a front vowel. You can have nisab, you can only have nisab, something like that. So, okay, well behaved. But now you probably remember that E was among the vowels which didn't have any back counterpart. So how do they handle this problem? They just disregard this problem. So if they have a suffix which contains E somewhere in their in its structure, then it's applied to the back vowel words without any alternation at all. So for example, madnige is a possible word in Kalmyk, although matn is a back vowel word, nevertheless ig is quite possible. So they have these suffixes. So if ig would be the accusative case suffix regardless of whether it's attached to a front vowel word or a back front vowel, no difference. Moreover, due to this feature, it's the only kind of context which creates, apart from borrowings from Russian, it's the only kind of context which creates words that have theoretically two stretches of vowel harmony within them. For example, here, okay, the first stretch here is, in this particular example, is very short, but theoretically I could have used a different, longer word with back vowels in its initial syllables. So this is uncle, uncle. When you attach the genitive suffix to it, genitive case suffix to it is abgin, and then you've got this e. So from this constant, from this syllable on, this word behaves as if it were a front vowel. So you can have, finally, you can have a word which starts with the back vowel a, and eventually in its last syllable it contains a front vowel a. So the rule of vowel harmony, because of this e somewhere in between, they have this mismatch, let's say. It's the only kind of exception I know of. Okay, so other rules which are also problematic for evocative ideal, let's say. So long vowels and initial syllables I put often here, but well, in most situations except for some predictables, more or less predictably, are shortened when they are used in isolation. So lots of shortening have taken place in the history of Kalmyk, and you can see some pairs here, and it's also a problem of, let's say, phonological representation of words. Let's have a almost minimal pair. So here we have U, which looks as if it started with a short vowel. But then you can guess that you can detect its real underlying form, let's say, if you have some form of this noun which has more than one syllable. And here you see that in the genitive, for example, it's urin, and it's also true for the dative, uride, and so forth. So it's long. I'm sorry, maybe you are not accustomed to this convention of writing the long vowels as just true vowels. It's not IPA at all, let's say, but as I said, hiatus is not possible. So whenever you see U and U, it's just one syllable with long U, not two vowels together. Okay, so is different, and its genitive is urin. So of course the thing is that historically it's the other way around. So historically this is the real form of this underlying form of this term, and here is the real form of this term. But in isolation, the context is lost. Curiously, although this is a robust phonological rule, they really, I'm a fan of native phonology or naive phonology, let's say. So, in fact, they are sure that this word here contains a long vowel. They know it very well. So they identify it with long vowels and so forth, and they tend to write it sometimes like this and so forth. Although phonologically it's short and there is no contrast. So again, the word forms are not predicted based on the initial form of the word. Of course, they're predicted if you have a complicated system with reconstructions and so forth. But if you imagine an agglutinative language as a language where you take the form in its initial, take a noun in its initial form, you can build the full paradigm based on this. Then it would work for Kalmyk in many respects, and this one as well. Yes.
Does this mean that we never have stressed long vowels?
Yes. I never thought about this in this perspective. Yeah. I think it's not possible.
Say it again, sorry. Say it again.
So I think that stressed long vowels are not possible.
But then you said that non-stressed non-vowel are not possible either.
No, they are possible. They are possible in the first syllable
Okay,
of
so it's syllables,
words
not
which
stressed.
contain many syllables.
Okay, sorry.
Then you have this contrast in the first syllable.
But if there is an unpronounced schwa in affix,
If it's unpronounced, yeah. The rule is that it depends on whether you pronounce it or not. So if it's unpronounced, then the first vowel is shortened. If it's pronounced, then it's stressed, and the first vowel should remain in its original form. So in particular, it might be long as well. Yeah. Yes.
So we may consider words as consisting of only the final syllable and not of the first syllable, so to say.
Yeah, in a certain way, yeah, I agree.
Well, the notion of it can be in different ways in different languages. That really, for instance, for Germanic languages, monosyllabic words have their initial syllable, which is stressed and strong, etc., with all sorts of contrasts present. Whereas for these languages, admittedly, the final syllable is also in some ways prominent, and so monosyllabic words sort of have final syllables but don't have initial syllables.
Yeah, I think maybe it's a tricky but attractive way of viewing the things.
Sorry, can I just a very small question for this claim that long vowels are realized as short in monosyllabics, but there are no minimal pairs for that.
What do you mean?
Like you have a root with a short vowel in the monosyllabic and long vowel realized as short vowel in monosyllabic.
As long as these are monosyllabic, you won't distinguish them. Yeah, that is true. So in order to see that they are underlyingly different, you have to build some word forms, which is always possible.
I'm just going back to your naive phonology because has any experiments have been conceptual theory?
No experiment. Well, maybe some, I don't know, maybe in A stuff they do something like that. It's kind of topic which sounds like they can do something because they've got some money and they've got some instruments, so they might make some experiments on this, but I'm not aware. Okay, so suffixes, unlike what you expect from well-behaved languages, agglutinative languages, some suffixes are not predictably alternating. For example, there is the dative suffix, which is either the or the, and it depends on the previous consonant So, for example, with in M and there is a list of consonants that trigger the choice of the vowel here. It's not the, but Sibir, a word which we hear very often, Siberia. The dative of this is Sibirte in Siberia. So it looks as an automatic rule, yeah. So the or the depending on the previous consonant, but in fact it's not. So there are other suffixes. This one, for example, the habitual one, is always in the, regardless of what's the previous consonant. And this one, the committed associative case or something like that, is always started with the, regardless of what's the previous consonant. Okay? So the alternation sounds very natural, triggered by more or less voiced, whether the previous consonant is voiced or unvoiced and so forth, but in fact it's not automatic. It's specific for this particular dative suffix. It must be learned individually. Okay, so the summary is that there are lots of morphological complexities that we do not expect from a well-behaved agglutinative language, so we have to learn them individually. And the only question I have here is whether there are other languages which we know are agglutinative, and if we take a closer look if in fact the situation is similar. Okay, that's it for today. We don't have time for questions today, but I think you can ask your questions whenever you want.